We're now going to start our policy block, that's recommended draft policy 2017-12, require new POC validation upon reassignment. This is a recommended draft policy, therefore it could easily be recommended to the Board of Trustees. In fact, it has been in the past, and it could be adopted. So you could have this adopted between now and the next meeting. So, Origin, ARIN Policy Proposal 247, draft policy last November, revised March this year, recommended for adoption in March. Presented at ARIN 41, went to last call, and was moved to the board for their review for adoption in May. The board reviewed it and remanded it to the ARIN Advisory Council. This doesn't happen very often. I can think of offhand one or two other occasions in the history of the organization. A.C. Shepherds, Chris Tassett, and David Farmer. So what does the policy do? It requires that all requests for reallocation or detailed reassignment that result in the creation of a new POC, point of contact object, be validated by ARIN prior to approving the request. So presently you can do a detailed reassignment and put contact information in, even if that contact's unknown to ARIN, and you can put any name, any phone number, any address, any email, and it creates that as a new point of contact record in our database. This says the point of contact has to actually acknowledge their contact. Validation will be accomplished by contacting the new POC by email. If the contacted POC, so the POC has an email that's supplied, if they fail to acknowledge that their contact information is correct, ARIN will reject the reassignment request. So you make a reassignment request, detailed information, and if the contact that's created doesn't confirm that they're a valid contact, the information is correct, then your reassignment is failed. There's a big change to business processes because people presume when the reassignment's done, it's done, not almost done, might be thrown out. And so this was something that the AC has discussed a bit. There was some discussion about the wording of the reassignment process to recommend exactly how the AC wants us to do. And so there's been some improvements there. The process is automated for many ISCs, therefore resulting POCs are not validated prior to being created in the ARIN database. This creates unknowing POCs who have no idea what whois is or even who we are. When they receive the email annually, right now we annually tell someone, oh, you're a POC in our database, and people go, ARIN, POC, what are you talking about? This is why an unvalidated POC is particularly problematic, at least if it's done when you're creating service, you'd know about it. It can also cause multiple POCs, since the same person with a slightly different address, slightly different email, slightly different formatting will end up with a new POC, and you end up with one person who's actually in the database 11 times with different spellings. The policy text recommends a big change to operations. The largest change would be the engineering department. It's a major amount of effort because we have to not only come up with this new process, but test it with the community that has automation that does these detailed reassignments. It's going to be about 6 months of planning and development work, not counting the interaction with the community. When the work's complete, there'll have to be a period of time where ISPs need to retool the way they interact with us, because some of them may want to pre-validate, some of them are not going to pre-validate, but I want to go back and visit to see if their request has ultimately failed. When you do a request, we give you a status code, and then you go on and do other things. That status code is now incomplete if it says success, because in truth it's queued, might be successful, we'll let you know in 10 days depending on what the POC did. So that means a change to business processes for ISPs. When it's put in production, all current systems developed by ARIN customers will have to be updated in order to continue working. There will be a synchronization issue when we deploy this policy, because the people who have automation need to coordinate with us. We do have a test environment, but it's going to be, it will still be on day of deployment an exciting exercise to make sure everyone knows we're now running on the new processes. The draft policy would not have a direct effect on RSD as far as processing the requests, because almost all of these are done completely automated, but we will end up with increasing customer support calls because people will call us to ask, Why am I getting this request? Why am I, because they currently do when we do POC validation, now they'll be getting it when they get the detailed reassignment. The POCs will call us up and say, I am getting this message, and those will be moved up in time. This increase in interaction with organizations that do not have a direct relationship could result in the need of additional staffing. Because not only is it moving it up, but the operators are going to be more anxious to get this validated because it's their request. So we all have the operators and the customers both trying to figure out how to get this done so the operator can do their reassignment. One possible improvement in the business processes regarding this would be if it says the abuse contact would be put in the reallocation or detailed reassignment record and then have the request approved. In other words, approve the request with the abuse record if nothing else goes through. ARIN would issue the notification of the proposed contact and the proposed contact validated. The new validated form would replace the abuse. This way, there'd be certainty that the request is valid even if the POC doesn't validate. This request would result in us reducing the number of POCs associated with a single email, which reduces the number of POC validation requests, so that's a benefit. Today, we're currently sending emails. Here's the numbers from our database. We have about 465,000 email addresses in the ARIN database. 15,000 of them are used on 5 to 9 POCs, 4,000 on 10 to 24. We have about 1,261 who are used on more than 25 POCs. No material legal risk. Resource. This is a large change. It will take 6.5 months of development work. There will need to be extensive testing. I will now turn it on to the ARIN Advisory Council to give their presentation. And at this time, I will ask Chris Tassett to come up.
Thank you very much. So we've been through the problem statement. We know what that is, so you can have a quick look at that just to refresh yourselves, but I won't dwell on it. And so the actual text that would be introduced if this change goes through is on your screen there. I'll give you just a bit of time to read that again to refresh your memory. So, as you heard, this is a very big implementation change for ARIN and also requires coordination with those who do automated SWIPs for detailed reassignments. So as a result of that, the significant resources that ARIN would incur in order to implement this, the proposal was sent back to the AC for further consideration, especially with respect to technical soundness. And it was suggested that we try to interview some of the largest, some of the ISPs who make numerous delegation requests. So we tried different ways of doing that. We posted to PPML. We sent a message out to the NANOG list, attendee list. We held consultations in a dedicated room during NANOG. And before I get to what we'd like to discuss here, I can tell you that there was actually not a lot of feedback, perhaps not that surprisingly. The reality is that there are probably just a handful of ISPs that do really high volumes of detailed reassignments using automated systems. We found that some of the feedback we got from even those who do large volumes of reassignments were that they were simple reassignments. So they didn't see an issue for themselves with regards to this policy one way or the other. So there are really a handful. Some of the feedback we got feedback from one of the major ones that if they do this, the system would break and they probably wouldn't try to develop their systems to coordinate with ARIN, suggesting that perhaps they would revert to simple reassignments instead. So that's where we stand. So there are really two questions that the AC would like to pose to this group and to have a discussion on. The first is, if your organization uses automation to generate detailed customer reassignment SWIPs, would it make the appropriate system changes necessary to continue performing detailed reassignments if this policy is adopted? And the second is, if the answer to question 1 is yes, what amount of reasonable lead time, if any, would your organization require before implementation of the policy to allow your organization to manage this change?
The microphones are now open, please.
I'll just leave those questions up.
That would be great. So any discussion on this policy, please approach a microphone. Front microphone, go ahead, please.
Daniel Dend, QA2. I stand in opposition to this policy. We've seen in the domain name world the imposition of a requirement to validate whois information, and it has been a disaster. Customers are uninterested in whois. Whois is something that we've built to serve the needs of the internet community. And when registrars are forced to take their domains offline because the email hasn't had the link clicked, especially an email that often looks like phishing, customers get angry. So what's ended up happening is that domain registrars have ended up getting permission from their customers to authenticate the request on their behalf. It's ended up being a complete waste of everybody's time, and in fact leads to less valid contact information, because what ends up happening is people put in their ISP's contact information so they can validate the request for themselves on behalf of the customer. So I would propose that if we look at this, the reason we do these detailed reassignments is to help the community have better contact information. And if we make that harder to do, it's going to happen less. Thanks.
Thank you. Any comments from, nope. Okay.
We're just taking input at this point.
Okay, rear microphone.
Kevin Bloomberg, The Wire. I no longer support this proposal. When I saw the original staff and legal and I saw the original intent of this proposal, that was one thing. This has turned into a cluster, a massive, massive overreach of what I consider to be a nuisance for myself personally and for some of my customers. It's gone from a nuisance to a major boondoggle within both ARIN and the external ISPs. I'm still confused as to why through automation there is a default to detailed records. I don't see today why that is needed en masse, and maybe those ISPs or organizations need a little bit of education. That's a different problem. I think there are different ways of solving this issue today. The lighter way might just be to allow a POC to get themselves out more easily on validation, because right now I believe they can only modify, maybe let them turf their POC record if they feel that it's invalid and shouldn't be there. That would not be done through policy. That would just be done, my record, my data is invalid, I don't want my data in the database. That can be dealt with outside of policy. It's just part of the standard process. But this is just, unfortunately, I like the concept of it, but it is a waste of time.
Thank you. Side microphone.
Owen DeLong, Sale Internet, ARIN AC. The original genesis of this proposal was not people who didn't want to be in the database. The original genesis was the issue of ISPs putting whoever was handy into reassignment data, creating large numbers of POCs that had nothing to do with administering addresses in large organizations in a way that the people actually responsible for the address space were unaware of these POCs being created until annual validation, which we have, by the way, now turned off in policy, caused the person whose name got put in to suddenly go, why am I getting this? And then they would forward it to the responsible party within the organization, who would then spend quite a few hours working on cleaning up these invalid POCs and getting them repointed to other people, because as the ISP's customer, we couldn't just go to ARIN and have ARIN modify the POC pointers. We had to actually go back to the ISP that issued the invalid reassignment and get them to clean it up. And it turns into quite the large game of whack-a-mole. And while Kevin calls it a nuisance, I would call it a much larger thing than a nuisance for some organizations. I know, for example, that in my last year working for one particular employer where this was a problem. I spent almost 20% of my time on this problem, cleaning these things up around the world. So I think that's more than a nuisance.
Okay, thank you for that feedback. Rear microphone.
Mike Joseph Mode. First off, I oppose this policy as currently written. I actually spent quite a bit of time yesterday talking to Mr. Sweeting and the folks at RSD about the types of organizations that are affected by this policy. And I don't mean entities, I mean organization records. Because I think what a lot of people don't realize, what I didn't realize after even many years at ARIN, is in fact there are hidden attributes about organization records that seem to exist that create multiple tiers, not just the customer records as a result of simple reassignment, but in fact some organization records, such as those as created in a product through reallocation and detailed reassignment, aren't actually real organization records, not until certain actions are taken, and it's fairly unpredictable to the entity whether in fact it's a real record or not. And I think Chris Tassett's comments about the feedback from ISPs is telling. Quite frankly, I think we're at a point where there's little to no justification for even allowing third-party creation of org records, let alone POCs. I think that the days of detailed reassignment need to go away. And that an ISP, in the case of reallocation, had better have their own org ID to begin with. So therefore, I think a better approach would be to focus on simple reassignment for the majority of cases. And for those cases where an entity needs detailed reassignment or reallocation, it should be to an existing org created by that entity. And we should begin to disallow the creation of third-party organizations and POCs. To this end, I filed a proposal to that effect last night, and I hope to see it posted to PPML soon after review by the Advisory Council. Therefore, my request and recommendation is not to advance this policy, to place it on hold in favor of a larger debate around the question of reallocation and reassignment in general.
Okay, thank you for the comment.
No, that's very
Sorry, go ahead.
helpful comment, thanks.
Front microphone, and well, actually before front microphone, just a reminder, please approach a microphone. We'll be coming soon close to the end of the discussion, and obviously if you're remote, please also inject. So, okay. Front.
Chris Woodfield, ARIN-AC Salesforce. The problem here, in my opinion, seems to be that we've gotten to a point where the creation of a detailed reassignment and the creation of the POC attached to that assignment has been coupled in a way that I don't think necessarily needs to be coupled. I'm thinking that maybe there might be a different solution here where a detailed reassignment does not create POCs, cannot create a POC. POCs can be created separately, and then when a detailed reassignment is made, could it be that a reassignment cannot be made to a POC that has not been validated? So when a POC is created, it must be validated. When a reassignment is made, it must contain a validated POC. That's procedural, not policy, but that maybe that could be implemented in policy in a way that says that detailed reassignments must contain a validated POC. And we could do that I think, in a much more simpler approach than the current proposal. And as such, I don't believe I can support the policy as written.
Okay, thank you. Go ahead. There's a comment here from John.
Yeah, I'll point out that we did send a message, the staff did an assessment of the detailed assessment of the implementation involved for this policy. And actually in that detailed assessment said, one thing that would make it perhaps more palatable and more straightforward in terms of workflow is if the policy was instead to say that detailed reassignments will be done on valid POCs and require organizations that wish to put detailed information in to first create a valid POC. That would at least put us on a normal workflow as opposed to a recovery workflow with timelines in it. So what he just mentioned is exactly what the staff posed as a lesser workload alternative to the same policy proposal. Neither of that changes the fact that This policy proposal is about how to improve the accuracy of POCs. And regarding detailed reassignments, as was noted earlier, there is presently text in NRPM Section 4 that requires detailed reassignment information for all blocks /29 or larger. And so if you don't want to have detailed reassignments at all, someone needs to propose something to change Section 4 in that regard.
Okay. Rear microphone, please.
Ron Grant, Skyway West. And I got up here with a very simple question, and it got very complicated by the time I got up to the microphone. So I will try to just state my support for the policy, but I think that we should probably listen to John's comment about that possibly modifying the implementation of the policy, because you know, I think I like the idea of making it possible for the organizations who are doing this to do things right and therefore let the workflow flow through properly rather than having everything stop at a grinding halt. If somebody sends in a proper, if somebody sends in an a reassignment and a point of contact that's a valid point of contact already that you've already verified, I don't see any reason why that would go through. I think it's only the complete unknowns that are the problem here. That's it.
Thank you. Please approach a microphone. We'll be closing them shortly. Front microphone.
I'm providing a relay of a remote participant and then would like to requeue for myself afterwards.
Okay.
Jason Schiller, Google ASOAC. Regrettably, this policy does not go far enough. The problem of swipping to an unwitting POC is not only limited to new POC creation. We need some mechanism to be able to detect when I am an unwitting POC and fix to the correct info. +1 to what Owen DeLong said, people in my org have been unwitting POCs and we have had reassignments to the wrong org ID.
Thank you. Why don't you do yours while you're right there?
I endorse Mr. Joseph's approach as well, and need to emphasize that John's observation regarding Section 4 is kind of critical to unlocking this whole problem.
Thank you. Rear microphone, please.
Yeah, very short. Michael Pettamore's Linux Magic. I'd like to support this proposal. I believe the community should rally around anything which can facilitate the accuracy of POC data. And in this case, of course, we are talking about space that's generally larger than a /29. This is not residential. These are sophisticated people. I believe that the challenges described will be a lot less than the worst case scenarios that have been commented on, and I fully support this.
Thank you. We are going to close the microphones after the next comment, so please, if you wish to speak, either start typing or approach a microphone, please. Thank you. Go ahead.
Michael Sinatra, ESNet, and apparent PPML potster of the week. I am concerned that this proposal's cure is worse than the disease, and I'm a little concerned about supporting it. As such, I probably don't. I think that I agree with all the other issues, and I think that we should review the other possibilities like Mike Joseph's proposal and what John talked about. But I'd also like to ask the AC if they consider just simply notifying rather than requiring validation. Just notify the POC that they've been SWIPed, that they are the contact now for this reassignment, and was that considered and was that rejected for what reason?
That really, we didn't focus on that significantly because we did view it as more of a validation issue.
I see John jumping to the rear mic for an intervention.
Yeah, John Sweeting, ARIN RSD. Just want to point out for all new POC creations, there is an email sent to that POC email address for any new POC creation.
It might be a reasonable compromise, though.
Okay, thank you. All right, microphones are now closed. We'll now empty our queue. Go ahead.
David Farmer, University of Minnesota, ARIN AC. I think, well, I support this policy concept and what its intent is. However, I think we went off the rails in a couple of ways. One, this policy focuses a little bit too much on the procedure we wanted, that we thought we wanted, and focus less on the outcomes we wanted. And so I think we should go back and rewrite this and do that a little bit. And then I think we need to have a larger conversation of and reevaluate the purpose of the information we're putting in the registry, who's actually using it for what purposes, and make sure that these things all align with our intents. I think it's probably well overdue for us to have we've been nibbling on this for a while now, and I think we just have to bite it off.
Okay. All right, final comments.
Yeah, I have a remote comment to relay, and I also failed to procedurally, my previous comment, I failed to say that Joe Provo, Google, ARIN AC, speaking for myself at that point in time,
Thank you.
support the concept, and I've changed my mind to not as support as written as now.
Okay.
Bookend that. Remote comment from Anthony De La Cruz from CenturyLink. If it is just a handful, have you considered working with those to see if they can improve the notification or selection they do? Can you share offline any stats on who are the big offenders or how my company would rank? I think we do a good effort to inform customers they are to be listed, but would be interested to see if that generates later work. Also, not in favor.
Thank you for the comment. All right, that ends comments unless there's anything from the...
Nope.
Okay, thank you, Chris, for the presentation. Whoa.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you very much.
I should
My
have been
apologies.
standing.
The final comment is over here.
Thank you. Suzette Burley from Digicel, Jamaica. I just want to say that I'm in support of the policy. While there are some nuances to be sorted through, it is important that we get it right. I think the discussion should continue so that we can work through the nuances so there can be accuracy, but at the same time, not overwhelming to the persons that we're validating, to the POC we're validating.
Okay. Thank you for that final comment, and my apologies. I had not noticed you there. So thank you again, Chris, for the presentation. With our counters in place, we are going to, as this is a recommended draft policy still, have our final poll of this ARIN 42 meeting. So the question will be, are you in favor or against advancing the policy as written? I would ask those remotely to cast their indication, and those in the room that can hear my voice, please, if you are in favor of advancing this policy, please raise your hand nice and high and keep it high. It's going to be a longer walk this time. Okay, you can lower your hands, and I would ask those all opposed to the proposal as written, please raise your hand nice and high. Just for a minute while we get it counted. Okay, you can lower, and we just need to wait for a second. I thank you all for participating in this policy process. If you have any feedback about any of the policies that you've seen, or you have an idea for a new policy based on what you've heard or spun, I encourage you again to find your local friendly advisory council member. They will be meeting shortly after this meeting, and they, as always, appreciate any and all input on policies, even just quiet supports or against anything that you can give them. It tremendously helps them do their job. And as their volunteers, anything we can do to make their life easier is a good thing. So, but with that, I see the final blue card of the meeting coming forward. Thank you, Michael. And thanks to Michael and Aaron, who magically count and do all the counting for us. So on the item of 2017-12, we have 102 people in the room remote. In favor, 5, against 31. This concludes this policy, and this will be passed on to the AC. Thank you. Over to John.
Thank you.